Hi everybody, students, teachers, parents. My name is Chris Stolz. I work at Tamanawa Secondary in Surrey in British Columbia in Canada, and I teach Spanish, English, and social justice, and sometimes philosophy and guitar, but sadly, not the mandolin. But anyway, I'm here to talk about comprehensible input. What does a comprehensible input classroom look like, and why do comprehensible input teachers do what they do? So, if you or the student that you know, your son or daughter or relative, is in a comprehensible input classroom, chances are that some of the following things are happening. First, your teacher will be speaking a lot of whatever language it is that you're learning, Japanese, French, Spanish, or English, if you are an ESL, an ELL learner. Chances are the teacher is checking fairly frequently to make sure that you understand what's going on. You're not being asked to guess at meanings of things. Your teacher is probably also repeating the vocabulary that they're trying to teach you as much as they can. And the way that they're doing this is probably, at least partly, through stories. They may have you guys acting stories out. They may be drawing on the board and narrating stories. They may be showing you video or film and talking about it in Spanish or French or whatever language you're learning. You're probably reading. You might be reading versions of stories that you've made up. You might be reading novels like these. Sorry, they're backwards, right? Novels designed for language learners. You are probably also not being forced to practice dialogues. You're probably not being given grammar stuff like this. And you're probably not being tested or evaluated on knowing grammar rules or having to memorize lists of words. So your teacher is presenting you with lots of input, lots of language, and they are expecting you to pick up the language from the input, basically. Now, why do we do what we do? How come we teachers don't, for example, give out worksheets? Why don't we ask you to memorize the rules for conjugating the AR verb or where pronouns go in French? And why do we always want to tell you another story or get you to make up another story? Well, the answer comes from a man named Stephen Krashen, Dr. Krashen. And Dr. Krashen is a professor emeritus at the University of California in Los Angeles. And in 1981, Dr. Krashen published a book called Principles and Practices in Second Language Acquisition. And in this book, he laid out a theory of how language is acquired. And I'm going to briefly walk you through this because it's the background for what we do in our classrooms. And I'll avoid jargon. So first of all, Dr. Krashen proposed this. He said, if we get messages we understand, if we get comprehensible input, we will acquire the language little by little. And after 40 years of research, we know that this is in fact the case. Babies do it automatically. We adults can do it quite easily. All we have to do is pay attention to whatever we're hearing, and if it's made comprehensible in some way through translation with aids like gestures, tone of voice, and so on, if we understand the meaning of what we're listening to or reading, we will slowly pick it up. So that's the first thing. So in a classroom, we're trying to deliver lots of comprehensible input to our students. The second thing Dr. Krashen proposed was that there is a difference between learning and acquisition. Now, learning is something we do, for example, in a math class. In a math class, you have to memorize some rules, and you have to practice using those rules on numbers. In, for example, a history class, you need to know some names, some dates, some events, and there are some things that you have to do. You have to make predictions, you have to draw inferences, things like this. These involve the conscious mind, they involve learning, and they're what we call declarative memory. They're stored in declarative memory. The same goes true for most sciences, right? Now, language, Dr. Krashen suggests, is acquired and stored and used unconsciously, subconsciously. In other words, we can be perfectly competent with a language without knowing the grammar rules, without even knowing what vocab we know and don't know. And I'll give you a little demo in a minute about that. Dr. Kreshn also proposed, as a result of the acquisition and learning distinction, that there was very little point to teaching people and having people practice grammar the way it was traditionally done. And the reason for this is that conscious grammar knowledge does not really influence our subconscious, where language is acquired and stored. And Dr. Kreshn also talked about the natural order hypothesis, which is basically that the brain is on its own schedule in terms of what it picks up. So in English, the classic example is the third person S. A sentence like, she wins marathons. That S on wins, that is late acquired. Anybody, a German, a French person, a speaker of Arabic, a speaker of Chinese, when they learn English, they will learn that S wins late. It's part of how the brain works. And we can't change the natural order. And one of the things that comes from that is that there is not necessarily an ideal preset sequence for picking up language. In other words, we shouldn't necessarily teach, for example, the present tense and then the past tense and then the next past tense, or all the words we can for food and then all the words we can for clothing. It turns out the brain is more or less on its own schedule in terms of what it wants to remember. Okay. Dr. Kreshn has also proposed what he calls the affective filter hypothesis. And this is really simple. It just means that when people are unstressed, when they understand things, and when they're not confused, when they're happy, they're more able to pick things up than if they are stressed out or self-conscious or otherwise uncomfortable. We know this is true broadly in other aspects of life, and it's also true for language learning. And this is one of the reasons why in a comprehensible input classroom, we do not typically ask that all students do lots of public speaking, that they do not have to generate loads of output, because we understand that it's difficult, especially for beginners, and we don't want people to feel self-conscious. And also, we don't need to talk. We acquire through listening and through reading. Okay, now let's go to the board for a brief discussion of grammar and how we do and don't acquire it. Okay, now here's a brief talk about the distinction between acquisition and learning. So here's a sentence: I enjoy running. This is grammatical and it's comprehensible. Here is another sentence: I enjoy to run. This is comprehensible, but it's not grammatical. If you're an English speaker, you understand that there's something wrong with the second sentence. Do you know what it is? Probably. You might have said something like, well, you can say I like to run or I enjoy running, but you can't say that. Now, here's the question for you. How do you know this? When you were a kid, did somebody sit you down and say, well, there's a class of verbs where you can use infinitives after, or another class where you can't? Did somebody sit you down? No, they didn't. You learned this rule, and I'm using the word rule in quotation marks, from input. You heard thousands and thousands of hours of English, and your brain figured it out. Now, you weren't consciously taught the rule, yet you can follow the rule. You are probably never going to say something like, I enjoy to run, right? So you don't consciously know the rule, yet you can appropriately use it, right? Now this is why in a comprehensible input classroom, we do not give grammar lectures and spend a lot of time obsessing about grammar rules, things like conjugations and verb classes and types and pronoun placement. What we do is we deliver lots of the target language, and we allow students to do what the brain does, which is to pick up the grammar from the language. As Lom Cato, the great Hungarian polyglot, said, we learn grammar from language and not language from grammar. Okay, so we know that people acquire languages through getting comprehensible input, through getting messages they understand. We know that we cannot really influence the order of acquisition of grammar. People's brains are going to pick up what they want when they want, and we have little control over it. We know that we need a lot of input to pick up the language. We know that we need to have things repeated in varied contexts. And we know that we need people to be happy and stress-free, to be, as Krashnan says, open to input. And we also know that teaching grammar to the conscious mind or teaching vocabulary to the conscious mind, making people memorize rules or vocabulary, doesn't really work very well. So this is why we do what we do in the classroom. When we make up stories with students, we teachers are trying to use as few different unique words as possible and to reuse them a lot. Okay, we're trying to recycle the vocabulary. A word like tiene, which means he has or she has in Spanish, or you have. A word like that, tiene, is very important. It's one of the, what Dr. Terry Waltz calls the super 7 verbs. It's important. We want students to hear that verb over and over and over in different contexts. Yo tengo 49 años. I'm 49. La chica tiene 15 años. The girl is 15. Cuando yo tenía 5 años, me gustaba jugar en la arena. When I was 5, I used to really like playing in the sand. We need to hear that verb tener in a million different places, in a million different ways, and our brain will pick up how to do that. Okay, so what do we do in a classroom? Stories. When we make up a story with the students, the fact that students can have input into what happens and the characters is a way to make the input more compelling. It's more interesting. It's more interesting for kids to talk about things that they are interested in than to expect us to expect them to memorize things, right? It's like with reading. What do you, as an adult or as a young person who can read in their spare time, what do you read? Things you find interesting. So we want to use stories because they're inherently interesting. When we use stories, we are able to repeat the vocab a bunch. If we have 3 characters in a story and they're all going through something similar, we can hear the vocabulary over and over. We use movies or video clips and pictures for the same reason. We can get students to take video or photos and we can talk about them in the target language. We can watch bits of film in the target language. This is interesting. If it maintains students' attention, if they understand it, and if we can repeat the words lots in a meaningful situation, people will acquire. And that is why sometimes class stories get very weird. We have the flying loaves of bread or the angry raindrops or the purple dinosaur, right? These things, while not realistic in the sense of, that you're never going to go to France and, have to deal with a purple dinosaur, but you are going to go to France and have to use, the verb avoir, or you're going to have to go to Germany and you're going to have to say, haben Sie bitte, right? So we're going to use high frequency vocabulary. We're going to use it over and over. The aim of this is to get students accustomed to useful vocabulary. We want them to soak it up from meaning and not from memorization and study. And we want them to enjoy their experience in the language classroom. And if in addition to this, we can get them to do some reading, we can write out versions of stories that we make up, or we can give them novels, all the better. If our students want to go online and use LingQ or Duolingo or any other platforms, if they enjoy that, that's great. But the bottom line is this. We comprehensible input teachers, we want our students to succeed in language. We want all of our students to succeed. And we want them to succeed by giving them lots of interesting language that they'll pay attention to, that we can repeat. And if we can do that, either through creating stories, telling stories, or having students read, then we are succeeding. Anyway, thank you for your time, and I hope you have learned something.